Well, good morning from Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and we're so glad you're joining us for this awesome conversation, how to prevent the next pandemic. I'm going to be handing it over to our incredible lineup, but first, we have just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. There's a lot to cover, so our speakers won't be answering your questions live today, but please still submit your questions. Once we finish, we'll compile all your questions that you submitted, get them to our lineup, and they'll record their responses and send that recording to all our registrants in the coming weeks. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Maria Vankergrove, the COVID-19 Technical Lead and Emerging Diseases and Zoonoses Lead at the Department of Prevention and Preparedness of Epidemics and Pandemics for the WHO. She also happens to be a Cornell alum. Maria, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, my name is Maria Van Kerkhove, and I lead our work on emerging diseases and zoonoses in the Health Emergencies Program in the Department of Epidemic and Pandemic Preparedness at the World Health Organization. Thank you so much for having me on this webinar hosted by my alma mater, Cornell University, which makes me particularly pleased to talk about this really important topic, which is very close to my heart, on preventing the next pandemic. The reason this is so important is that in the world that we live in, we will continue to see outbreaks, epidemics and pandemics in our lifetimes. This is just a schematic looking at the last several decades of looking at pathogens that have spilled over from animals to humans, causing outbreaks, causing epidemics, and causing pandemics. And again, this is something that we expect this trend to continue. And the reason it is so important that we approach this with a One Health approach, taking into consideration humans, animals, the ecosystem and environment that we live in, is because of the way we live on this planet and the drivers of spillover, looking at deforestation, looking at changes in patterns of migratory animals in animal trade. And many of these pathogens are zoonotic. And we need to understand the animal reservoirs and how people get infected. If we take some examples, Ebola, Marburg, pathogens that are expanding its geographic range. MERS coronavirus hasn't gone away. H5N1 and the geographic range and spillover into mammals has expanded in the last several years. Zika has not gone away. And the reason this is so important is that in this interconnected world that we live in, a pathogen that is identified in one part of the world could be on the other side of the planet within 24 to 48 hours, because these pathogens do not respect borders. So it is critical that we work with our partners, with FAO, with WOHA, with UNEP, with taking a multidisciplinary approach, looking at how we work and live with animals in the environments that we share, to understand the drivers of spillover, to better mitigate the spillover potential in preventing outbreaks, preventing pandemics from happening in the first place. And where we can't prevent that from happening, do a better job of actually mitigating their impact. So we need to take a multidisciplinary approach and work with partners all over the world, not just across sectors, but across disciplines at international, national, and sub-national levels to be able to study these appropriately. And the reason this is so critical is that the risk is present. We are still dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but we are also looking at other pathogens that have epidemic and pandemic potential. This is a map that's looking at the aggregate risk of a number of pathogens with epidemic and pandemic potential at a global level. And in this map that you see here, it's a draft map that WHO is working on with IHME, the Kerry Institute, and a number of other partners around the world. This includes chikungunya, dengue, Zika, Hendra, Nipah, MERS, Mpox, plague, Ebola, Marburg, Lassa, SARS-CoV-2, CCHF, highly pathogenic avian influenza, H5N1, and Rift Valley fever. And what is so critical about this map is to show that this risk, although it may not be the same or the same level of risk everywhere on the planet, we are all at risk. And we need to have better surveillance in animals and humans at the animal-human interface, better diagnostic capacities, sequencing capacities, clinical care, partnerships to be able to mitigate the spillover potential. And why this is so critical is that what we want to be able to do is to limit the emergence or the spillover at local levels, working with communities on better detection and surveillance and risk assessment, working with community health workers, village animal health workers, with all different sectors of the government, so that we could prevent these spillovers events from expanding. So we have better surveillance, we have better rapid and accurate diagnostics, we have better risk communication, we have optimized clinical care, we have better R&D. So across the spectrum, we have to take this One Health approach. We've learned so much from the COVID pandemic. And one of the ways we're thinking for the future is strengthening the global health architecture, taking into consideration what we're calling these 5 C's listed here of collaborative surveillance, community protection, emergency coordination, safe and scalable care, and access to countermeasures. And what is really critical also is the promise and the commitment to the future, which the member states are discussing right now with this pandemic accord of looking at governance, surveillance, systems, and financing. Financing is absolutely critical. We are not in a period in which we have quote unquote peacetime. Pandemic preparedness is a constant. Everything that we have done for COVID-19 is pandemic preparedness for the future. And there are a lot of established financing discussions that are happening right now. There's a new pandemic fund that is looking at sustainable finances for countries to be able to invest, continue their investment, continue the momentum on pandemic preparedness that we advanced so much during the COVID-19 pandemic. And ultimately, what we need is a world that's on alert. We need to be able to prevent and prepare so that we are reducing the health, social, and economic impacts of health emergencies. We will not be able to prevent all spillover events, all outbreaks, or even pandemics, but we can do a much better job than we did with the current pandemic that we're still facing. We need to learn from this trauma and use the trauma and the experience that we've all had to be better for the future. And the foundation for all of this is robust science. It's collaboration. It's working with all of you around the world. And thank you for hosting this webinar. But ultimately, we need transparency and we need trust, because the information that is learned from the field, in the labs, through studies with communities needs to be shared, and that information needs to be used to turn into action. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you. I wish you a very successful webinar, and I cannot wait to watch it myself. Hi, my name is Maria Van Kerkhove. Hi, my name is Maria Van Kerkhove.
David?
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. And thank you, Nicholas. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning live for this seminar on preventing pandemics using nature-based solutions and policy opportunities. My name is David Quammen. I'm coming to you from verdant Bozeman, Montana. My job this morning is to bring our speakers on stage and otherwise mainly stay out of the way. We're very glad to have all of you joining us, and your questions will be welcome, and your questions will be answered by our speakers after the fact. So be assured that whatever you want to ask, please type it in, send it to us, and you will get responses. It's a truism that we've all heard that spillovers are common, but pandemics are rare. The inference from that statement, 2 inferences, I think, are first, a certain fatalism about the commonness of spillovers, and secondly, the suggestion that we can stop spillovers from becoming pandemics by surveillance, by early detection and response, containment. But the guiding premise of this seminar is to not be fatalistic about the commonness of spillovers, to take concrete ecological steps to reduce that commonness and prevent spillovers. For instance, think of the 2014 Ebola event in West Africa. 11,000 deaths, 28,000 cases, 11,000 deaths, and we know from molecular evidence that it all began with one spillover. You prevent that one spillover, and you might save 11,000 lives. That's an invigorating challenge. So to talk about these things, our first speaker is Dr. Raina Plowright. Raina is Rudolph J. and Catherine L. Steffen Professor and Cornell Atkinson Scholar at Cornell University in the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health. She studies and has for a long time the connections between environmental change and pathogen spillover. She joins us from right here in Bozeman, Montana. Raina?
Thanks, David. And I'll just get my slides here. When we think about events that have planetary scale consequences, we think of something enormous, like a volcanic eruption or an asteroid hitting the Earth. But today, we're talking about a planetary scale event that started at the microscopic scale, perhaps as few as a few virus particles that then filtered through nature and into humans and eventually affected almost every human on the planet. We call this event zoonotic spillover. It's the passage of a pathogen, or like a virus or some kind of microbe, a pathogen from an animal to a human. But it's not as simple as the name suggests. It requires this series of unfortunate events. First, there has to be a reservoir host. It has to be infected with the pathogen. It has to be overlapping with humans, infected with the pathogen, shedding that pathogen. There has to be a mechanism of exposure of humans to the pathogen, and sometimes that's through human behavior and often through a bridging host, like this pig here that is foraging around bat excreta and then has contact with humans. And the pathogen has to be able to infect humans. And this involves, if it's a virus, binding to the receptor on the cell and evading the immune response. And if it achieves all of that, there's a zoonotic spillover. But to become a pandemic, there are more barriers that need to be crossed. The pathogen has to thrive in humans. It has to be able to transmit effectively through humans. So I want to make a distinction right now between these two processes, what I've described as spillover and spread, because they're really different processes. They involve different mechanisms, different interventions, different preventions. And almost all global attention is focused on this component, spread, after a pathogen is already circulating in human communities. Think about vaccines and therapeutics, early detection. These are all really critical tools, but they're difficult to deploy quickly and equitably. So today we're talking about spillover, all of the processes that lead to that spillover event when that first human gets infected. This is the pandemic foothold. And if we can stop this, we can pretty much stop everything else. And we call this primary pandemic prevention. But some say this is impossible, but our work suggests otherwise. We work on these large nectar-feeding bats in subtropical Australia. They're the hosts of a virus called Hendra virus, and it jumps from bats to horses and then to humans. And it has an 80% fatality rate in horses and a 60% fatality rate in humans. It doesn't appear to affect the bats. Historically, these bats are aggregated in huge populations and fed on nectar and pollen in native forests. And they moved large distances to find this food. And as they did, they would spread pollen across the landscape and keeping our forests healthy. But these bats have lost almost all of the habitat that supports them in winter. And now, as a consequence, they've moved into areas that are occupied by humans, so cities and farms where they feed on fruit. And these are suboptimal environments for bats. And we see these bats shedding more virus in these places. And this is exacerbated by climate, specifically El Nino-driven food shortages. However, we've observed that when there are rare pulses of flowering in remnant winter habitat, the bats leave the cities, they leave the farms, and they go back to native habitat. And every time this happened in our 25-year study period, there were no spillover events. And in fact, this phenomenon was so protective that the entire subtropics experienced this decrease in spillover risk. This would be like the area of some of the largest US states. So in this era of high-tech solutions, we think we have a very practical and sustainable solution that actually addresses spillover right at the root cause, and that is replace those winter flowering habitats. And this restoration, this rewilding would have a direct human health benefit. But studies like this that span from ecosystems all the way to spillover are very rare. And I want to give you a sense of the discrepancy between ecological research and biomedical research. During the pandemic, the number of studies of the protein on the surface of the coronavirus. This is key for vaccine development. The number of studies numbered thousands. By the end of the pandemic, tens of thousands. Well, now tens of thousands. I don't think we've ended the pandemic. Conversely, the number of studies on the circulation of coronaviruses in bat populations, the reservoir host of coronaviruses, was 1 study. It is now 3 studies. So in the absence of so much information to understand spillover, how do we proceed with primary pandemic prevention? Well, we assembled this group of 30 experts to discuss this. We focused on bats as case studies for a few reasons. One, bats they host, or the evolutionary origins of the majority of WHO priority pathogens are in bats. They're very sensitive to environmental change. They're perhaps actually zoonotic sentinels. They're insect eaters, they're pollinators, they're seed dispersers, and we would be much less healthy without them. So we found that there was strong evidence for 3 mechanisms that increase spillover risk where we could intervene with ecological countermeasures. First, land use change increases contact between reservoir hosts and humans. It increases the stress and decreases the energy available to reservoir hosts, which leads to increased viral shedding and infection. And this is really, this involves the health of individual animals, individual bats in this case. And land use change promotes behaviors of humans that leads to these mechanisms of exposure. So to counter those mechanisms of spillover risk, we devised 3 very simple rules, really to help policymakers find a tractable path forward for pandemic prevention. That is, protect where bats eat. This can be as specific as those habitats that just flower in winter for a Hendra virus, or as broad as whole ecosystems. Protect where bats sleep. You can't underestimate how important it is to decrease stress in places where animals aggregate. And protect communities, and this is people and their associated animals. So those countermeasures actually directly address this land use induced contact, stress, and exposure. And although we use bats as a case study here, these strategies actually are broadly applicable across taxa within the ecological context. And I just want to note that these ecological strategies not only address pandemic risk, but they also address the biodiversity crisis and climate change. So they are the trifecta for the planet. Thank you.
Raina, thank you very much for that. I want to ask you to come back to that final thought about the trifecta for the planet, those 3 big parallel problems that we have. But first, let me ask you a couple of smaller questions, which are not any too small. First of all, and you can give me concise answers to these if you wish. I know that some of this is very complicated, but the question that one always gets from the general public when you start to talk about Hendra or Nipah virus or Marburg virus or Ebola virus or a number of the others is, why bats? Why bats? Why is it that bats are the reservoir hosts of at least seemingly such a large proportion of these new emerging viruses?
Right. Yes, it is. It's a very common question. And I mean, there are many different answers, but partly just there are so many species of bats. Like 20% of mammal species are bats. So of course, we'd expect many viruses to be amongst this particular taxa. They also seem to be able to host these viruses that are very virulent to humans, but without actually having any form of disease themselves. And we have a few theories for why that is. One is we think that because they have to fly, they have to have these extraordinarily high metabolic rates. They have mechanisms to decrease the damage from oxidative stress from this high metabolism. And those mechanisms are also tied up with how they can resist viral infection, or resist at least the pathology associated with viral infection. They seem to be also very, very sensitive to environmental change. And Deanne is going to actually talk about their energetic requirements soon, so I'll leave that to her, but their energetic requirements are extraordinary. And so when we take away their habitat, we're taking away the food that needs to be available at all times for these animals.
You also said that one of the steps for a spillover to occur, one of the necessary steps, is that the virus must thrive in humans and be transmissible. A virus coming out of a reservoir host, coming out of a bat, for instance. The bat is shedding it. The bat has some sort of contact or overlap with humans. The humans get exposed to the virus gets into humans, but then it must thrive and be transmissible. How important is the virus's evolutionary capacity at that point? The virus's evolvability, and how important is that factor generally in understanding patterns of spillover?
So I want to make a distinction there, because the virus doesn't need to thrive to achieve spillover. So to achieve spillover, the virus needs to be able to somehow enter the human body, and that might be through a cut, it might be through aerosols, through breathing, or through consuming the virus. But then the virus has to be able to evade things like the mucus in our respiratory tract. It needs to be able to bind to a cell, bind to the receptor in a cell, enter the cell, co-opt its replication machinery, exit the cell, which is actually really hard for influenza viruses, avian influenza, to exit the cell, and then evade this long cascade of immune response. And then it's achieved spillover. But for many pathogens, that's the end of it. So like for rabies, for example, it kills the human host, but there's never transmission of rabies from human to human. So the thriving part is necessary for the next step, which is the efficient transmission from human to human. And it doesn't have to just be able to thrive, which means it needs to be able to amplify itself. It has to amplify itself in the right tissues. So if it amplifies itself in your foot, it might be pretty hard to transmit to the next person, but it amplifies itself in the upper respiratory tract, causes coughing and sneezing and aerosolization of virus, like what we saw with this current pandemic. Then it has a very efficient mechanism for transmission. How important is evolution? Well, there seems to be some viruses that are able to do this probably straight out of the bat. For example, Ebola virus and Marburg virus, perhaps not much or if any evolution is required for the virus to spill over and then transmit. For some viruses, it seems that there might be some adaptation, and often that happens in an intermediate host, like maybe a traded wildlife species or a domestic animal. So it's different for each virus. And for disease X, the undiscovered viruses out there that could cause the next pandemic, we don't know. Maybe they're ready to go in the reservoir host and they just need that mechanism of exposure to a human. Maybe they need to be transmitted through a domestic animal population or a traded animal population to evolve the right fit for the virus to the receptor of the human cell. It remains to be seen.
Thank you. Let's go back to your trifecta, the trifecta for the planet. You say we can protect biodiversity, we can mitigate climate change, and we can prevent pandemics if we do some of these fairly simple, straightforward ecological measures. I was glad to hear you say that, because this is something that I've been talking about too. These three independent but interconnected huge problems, planetary scale problems that we have: loss of biological diversity, climate change, and the threat of pandemic disease. A lot of people, particularly among the general public, nowadays tend to think of climate change as the problem on planet Earth, human caused, that explains all other problems. People will say, well, tell me how COVID-19 was caused by climate change. Well, COVID-19 probably wasn't caused by climate change. It seems to me there's some educating that we have to do to help people understand that these are three related but co-equal problems with a common ultimate cause, human impact on the natural world. Tell me what you think about that. Is that true? And are we making progress in helping people understand these three distinct problems?
Yes, I'm not sure we're making a lot of progress in this understanding, but I'll just give you an example from Hendra virus, where we understand that replacing this critical habitat that feeds bats in winter would reduce spillover risk. But if we replace that habitat, those trees, actually there's 5 species of trees that flower in winter, they happen to be excellent habitat for koalas and critical for nectivorous animals, specifically migratory nectivorous animals. We plant trees, we can also restore watersheds. So we can restore biodiversity, we can restore our landscapes, we can hopefully restore the pollination services that the bats are losing, that we're losing as the bats move into cities and farms and stop the nomadic behavior. And we're also planting trees that capture carbon. So if we're really smart, we could do all three at once. And I think it just requires people getting into the same room and thinking about where is the trifecta, where is the overlap in these three crises, and what are the really strategic interventions we could make that address all three at once.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Raina. Thank you. Deanne Reeder is our next speaker. Deanne is professor of biology at Bucknell University. She studies disease ecology, behavior, physiology, and conservation. And especially now, her current efforts are focused on the relationships between bat health, ecosystem health, and human disease risk, in particular in connection with the epauletted fruit bats of Central and East Africa and the possibility that they may be reservoir hosts of Ebola.
Great.
Deanne
Thank you. Yeah.
is in joining us from Pennsylvania. Deanna?
Great. Thank you, David, so much. In order to connect human activities to bat physiology, I would like for us to imagine a day in the life of a bat. Just wait here for my slides. We should have a lovely fruit bat coming up with a pup attached to her as she's getting ready to fly. One of the things that's really important to remember is that bats are the only mammals that fly. And that makes them ecologically unique and physiologically unique, right? They are different from the other mammal groups. Now, flight is really expensive, especially when you add it on top of other energetically expensive states like pregnancy and lactation, which are unique to mammals. And consequently, bats need a ton of energy and they have voracious appetites. Now, bats, like other organisms, have evolved over thousands of years to perfectly balance their energy needs under prevailing environmental conditions, but they're now under stress. And to think about how bat stress might relate to viral shedding, let's take a look at the energy that a bat needs. Now, we all need a certain amount of energy every day just to go about our basic daily lives. It was showing it here in green. We need to fuel our cells, move around, find food, find water, and to maintain our immune system with our other physiological systems as well. Now, at any given time, there's a certain amount of food or energy available, and that often varies seasonally. Now, bats optimize their energy intake and energy expenditure, and they time the most expensive activities like migration and reproduction, we're showing it here in purple, to those periods in which more food is available. So you can see that the total energy available exceeds the energy that is needed, and life is good. They're balanced. Under normal conditions, there's a buffer here. It's like a little evolutionary wiggle room, so that in years with poor food availability, they can still get by. But bats, like other animals, are impacted by man-made perturbations in the environment. For example, fire, right? Now, fire could be something that occurs naturally. We know that there's natural fire cycles, but it also could be due to global climate change. And bats may need to fly further to find food and resting sites. And that requires more energy simply to survive. And then you add in those reproductive costs and migration costs, and the total energy needed increases. And now that wiggle room that they had is gone. And you add insult to injury, for example, by cutting down native forest, like Raina was talking about, and we may cause significant decreases in the total energy available. And now what we see is that the conditions reversed. The energy needed is much greater than what's available. So we're showing this in red. We can think of this as a form of chronic stress. It has significant consequences for bat health. And chronic stress in bats can also be triggered by repeated disturbance, like harassment of bats at their tree or cave roosting sites. Unfortunately, there's consequences, right? To compensate, the energy has to be redirected from other systems, including the immune system. And this is where we connect bat health to human health. Stress can lead to immune system dysregulation. That can cause an increase in the viral load in the bat and an increase in pathogen shedding. So there might be more viruses being emitted in urine and feces and saliva, for example. That would then lead to greater spillover risk. One of the things I want to point out is that this concept of stress and pathogen load and shedding applies to all animals, right? Whether we're talking about ducks and geese shedding influenza viruses, rodents shedding hantaviruses, primates shedding the simian versions of HIV, or even ourselves falling ill when chronically stressed. One of the things that I want to state really clearly here is that this spillover and our impacts on animals that are causing stress, potentially leading to greater levels of spillover, that's a human problem. It's never the bat's fault, or the duck, or the mouse, or the monkey, right? If we protect where bats eat and where they sleep and do the same for other animals, we can, with some pretty simple tools sometimes, mitigate these risks, right? That's something that's commonly missed. This is not just a bat story. This is a universal truth of what we're doing to wildlife. It has consequences for human health, animal health, and ecosystem health.
Thank you, Deanne. I'm very curious about bat immune systems.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that when there is stress, when there is an energy deficit, any animal may reallocate energy from some of its physiological processes. For instance, immune function.
Mm-hmm.
Bats already have a very particular, peculiar, unique immune system. How much do we know about that bat immune system? And what, if anything, do we know about what happens when a bat under stress withdraws some support from its immune system?
Sure. The immune system is really one of the most metabolically expensive systems. And we see animals, including bats, shutting that system off when they can't afford to be maintaining that system. The details of how the bat immune system works, especially against viruses, are being actively researched all around the world, including some of my own studies and those of many colleagues. And it really does seem that the bat immune system has a number of modifications that allow them to be either resistant or tolerant of viruses, especially those like Hendra, Nipah, Marburg, rabies, that are of significant human health concern. There's some really interesting little nuances that, we're studying this at the molecular level to figure out what bats may be doing differently. In a general way, we can say that bats are really, really good at managing inflammation. When people die of COVID or die of Ebola, one of the reasons that they're dying, there's sort of a tipping point there when their immune system really kind of wreaks havoc and they go into this like inflammatory cascade, and it's their immune response that kills them. And bats are very good at reining in that particular system. We do know that bats have certain mutations, for example, in the sting genes, that allow them, particularly with their response to viruses. So sting stands for stimulator of interferon genes. And these keep inflammation, they allow you to respond to a virus when you need to. And if you can dampen these, it also helps keep inflammation in check. Every bat species has a mutation in that gene. There's all sorts of really interesting things that are happening. But we do have data from natural bat systems where when they are under stress, that their health suffers, right? And then that can lead to increased spillover. We know that pregnancy and lactation for animals, for mammals, is a period of extreme energetic stress. And some of the work of the Hendra system has shown in those cases that those animals are likely to have higher viral loads, and then they might be shedding greater. In our system, one of my main study species, when they are found in disturbed habitats, it significantly impacts their health. And so we're trying to understand all of those little nuances there.
Thank you, Deanne. And we will all be watching, I think, with great interest, your work on the epauletted fruit bat in Uganda and evidence, if any, for its role as an Ebola reservoir. So
thank you.
We await that with great expectations. Dr. T. Gomera is our next speaker. He's Director of Conservation Evidence for Bat Conservation International. He's a bat biologist. He works on data-driven strategies for the conservation of global bat populations, and he's joining us from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Teague.
Yeah, we think that straightforward and nature-based solutions can be used to minimize energetic stress to bats and really prevent pathogen spillover by protecting or enhancing where bat roosts and where they eat. So protecting where bats eat isn't really a one-size-fits-all scenario. Since bats are super diverse, they feed on insects, on nectar, and even other small vertebrates. If bats have enough nutritious food, they are less likely to become energetically stressed. And this is going to reduce that risk of viral infection and shedding. If enough food is available in relatively unmodified landscapes, then we know that bats are also less likely to use those areas with high human population densities. And this is going to reduce that human conflict. So protecting and restoring foraging habitat for bats is going to be a really large part of minimizing viral shedding. For example, this could mean protecting forests with native fruiting trees. This could also mean enhancing insect availability near roosts, or restoring drinkable water sources for both the insects that go to there and the bats that need to drink. The example that Raina used is a really great case that directly links protecting quality food resources to bat and human health. So protecting and restoring native gum trees in the Australia case is going to be a straightforward way to minimize future infections. But we know that bats forage in a lot of different ways, and so we have to think about specific bats and specific ways that we can use to boost their energy reserves. So in addition to where bats are feeding, we need to protect where the bats roost. We have to minimize disturbances in human interaction, especially when bats are most sensitive. Roosts are going to be places where they sleep, where they socialize, and they raise their offspring. And bats have very diverse roosting areas. They roost in caves, they'll roost in trees and in buildings. And being aware of the diversity of roosting locations is an important safeguard. And for many bats, this also means thinking at landscape scales, because as Raina pointed out, they will move between roosts during different seasons, and sometimes will be hundreds of kilometers. And roosts can be home to tens to hundreds, thousands, and millions of bats. But one of the things to remember is that the largest aggregations of bats are nearly always maternity colonies. And this is where bats are the most energetically sensitive. Bat roosts are really small natural features, and protecting them is a very specific and targeted management action that can have a huge and disproportionate effect on pathogen spillover. Roost disturbances by humans can be a consequence of direct use of that roost, like going out and harvesting guano or using the cave for tourism, or they can also be an intentional activity where bats are targeted for removal from that site. Unfortunately, when bats are targeted for harassment, it often results in more pathogens being spread into the environment, not fewer. We see this with rabies, for example. Protecting roosts is going to minimize stress on the bats, as well as minimize human contact during times when bats are most likely to shed a virus into the environment. And we know that now protecting where bats eat and where they sleep is going to put barriers in place that minimize bat contact. That's going to lead to viruses infecting humans, especially also our domestic animals. But we also need to protect those frontline human populations that regularly interact with bat roosts and foraging sites. A first step to do this is to decrease or eliminate this risk by identifying human behavior that increases risk to exposure, and then implement some kind of behavioral change. For example, the trade of bats can be prohibited, farmed wildlife can be protected from contact with wild bats, and communities that depend on bat-associated economic activities like guano harvesting or tourism or wildlife consumption can implement specific practices that minimize pathogen exposure. This may mean changing the time of the year that activities occur, or using protective equipment to minimize exposure risk. Our colleagues are going to discuss implementing some of these specific solutions and the challenges that come along with that. But we really feel that nature-focused solutions that protect where bats sleep and where they eat are going to have outsized effects on human health. They'll put barriers in place that prevent pathogen spillover. And really, enhancing natural environments is going to have multifaceted effects on human health increase biodiversity, mitigate effects of climate change, and should be one of the places that we really focus on our first line of defense for preventing future pandemics.
Thank you, Teague. One of the things you mentioned is for insectivorous bats, enhancing insect availability near roosting sites. That's fascinating to me. How do you do that? How do you enhance insect availability to bats?
So one of the really nice things about insect feeding bats is that their food, insects, are attracted to things like ultraviolet light. And so we've run experiments where we've put ultraviolet lights in forests that are near highly endangered bat species to increase and bring in the insects that these bats are going to feed on. And what we've seen is really high levels of bat activity around these feeders, around these lights. We can consider them feeders. And it's drawing the insects in, it's drawing the bats in. What we haven't really connected yet is how this really increases their overall fitness, their body conditions, for example. And we're looking to that in the future to really see what those kind of targeted interventions can do, and then how we can scale that up, especially for our most endangered and sensitive species.
You also mentioned that there are some communities, human communities, that depend on bats as a positive part of their cultures, their economies. For instance, guano harvesting, tourism in certain places, cave tourism, and the consumption of bats, wildlife as food. It's important to minimize those, I understand, but how do you do that? For instance, how do you persuade a community to stop harvesting guano? How do you persuade a community to stop harvesting bats as food? How do you bring thriving cave tourism situations to an end or make it more safe?
These are big challenges, and all of it really requires working with those communities that are, going through these different kinds of activities. Ali will talk a little bit about this and how education and really bringing that information back to the communities can help change that behavior. They don't want to put themselves at risk. Sometimes we just need to be able to implement change at specific times of the year. So, for example, when bats are in maternity colonies, this is not the best time to be going into a cave to harvest guano. This is when your exposure is going to be the highest risk. So maybe that other times of the year, you can actually go in and still extract that resource that you need, because guano is fantastic fertilizer. It's some of the best fertilizer available in the world. And it's also, it's relatively cheap. But also then maybe giving them and bringing protective equipment into the equation helps let that happen. Cave tourism for the same reasons. You don't go in when bats are really sensitive or when they're hibernating, for example. Maybe you alter tourism to be at the outside where bats are emerging. So there are a lot of different ways, but once organizations, once intervention, once local people understand what the needs are and how we can sort of work with the people around there to make that change happen, that we can really push forward the safety of those human populations and also the safety of those animals.
Great. Thank you, Teague. Thanks very much. Iroru Tanshi is next. Iroru is a postdoc fellow at the University of Washington, and she's co-founder of the Small Mammal Conservation Organization in Nigeria. She studies threatened bats in Afrotropical forest, and in particular West Africa and the Gulf of Guinea Islands. She's joining us today from Sao Tome Island. Iroru?
Hey, David. Yes, so Nigeria sits on the sort of the intersection. Let me pull up my slide. I don't think that's coming up here. Yeah, hold on. Sorry. Technology. All right, there we go. So Nigeria really sits between sort of the West and Central African flashpoints for disease outbreaks in West Africa. And that's just shown on that map by Peterson and Sami there. But what we've done in Nigeria is we've relied on evidence generated in the field with local people sort of examining cultures and norms to really understand how bats are threatened, and then use those to guide deployment of eco measures that have been, some of them that have been recommended here today, and especially protecting where bats eat and sleep. For example, we protect the Egyptian fruit bat that is cute and provides many ecosystem services. I mean, look at that, right? But it is sadly facing population declines, and it is implicated as a reservoir host for marburg. But in Nigeria, they are hunted for food. And you might ask why. Well, the species is attractive to hunters because it is large. So we're talking about a 200-gram bat, a relatively large species. But it can also get up to, say, maybe about half a pound. So this is quite some piece of meat, okay? But it also forms large congregations of thousands of individuals in caves. And so if you're a hunter in southeastern Nigeria, one visit to a cave gives you a lot of meat, not just for your family, but also to sell and make some income. And what we're seeing from our data is that one hunter can go into a cave and collect as much as 4,000 bats in one visit. There's no way that's sustainable. Okay, now we know within the context of zoonotic diseases that hunting and consumption increases the contact rates between bats and people. But what's less obvious is when some of this hunting is going on, you see that hunter there, what they typically do is they'll go into the cave and block that entrance with the net he's holding right there. And he would go and chase the bats, sort of herding them into the net. And that causes disturbance even for bats that are not captured, okay? So the ones that make it out alive are stressed. Okay, well, if we're having stressed bats, what Deanne said about, shedding and all of that starts to really kick in, okay? Now, so what we're doing is to really help some of that behavior change with hunters by providing alternative protein and alternative food source, income sources. But some of this work is focused on the twin forests of Afi Mountain Wildlife Sanctuary and Cross River National Park, which are unfortunately also threatened by wildfires. And some of those wildfires, in fact, all of the wildfires originate on farms, community farms around the parks. And what that means is for a population of bats that's already hunted and stressed, losing their habitat to wildfires just means you're amping up all of that stress, okay? So you're having hungry bats that are stressed. We're really talking about chronic stress 2.0 at this point. But where do hungry bats go? Where do stressed hungry bats go when their habitat is destroyed? Well, one of the places with people's backyards, to either get to fruit trees or even insects that are visiting fruit trees. So there's all of these huge implications to some of these, what you might consider individual actions a hunter went in or a farmer set a fire to their farms. So it really is a case where we're needing to respond at the source. It's kind of what Raina was talking about. We need to stop this at the source before it becomes a problem. And so our community-led wildfire prevention program equips 50 forest guardians, at least within this area, to stop fires at the source on community farms when they occur. And in fact, we're also training farmers to make sure that they deploy responsible fire burning techniques, so to speak, so farm burning techniques that then prevent fires from spreading from their farms to the forest. And it's kind of what Raina was talking about, the trifecta effects. This is really one of those cases where you're protecting where bats roost and where they eat, but also you're preventing loss of habitat for other biodiversity while simultaneously mitigating climate change. So it's really, it really does hit the nail on the head for all of these three problems.
Thank you, Aurora. Those fires in the Cross River National Park area, for instance, is this traditional agricultural burning exacerbated? Is that what you're saying? Exacerbated by climate change? So it's a 1-2 punch that's making these fires ever more damaging to bat habitat?
Yes, that's exactly right. So the forest has gotten drier over time because we're getting fewer and fewer rains, but also because the rains are, if you how do I say, it might be sort of unpredictable. That's the word. The rains become more and more unpredictable. But we're talking about fires that originate from farms because farmers use fires to condition the land before planting season. So they use that to manage weeds and then really help to sort of improve nutrients. So farmers need to burn their farms. But then climate change exacerbates that, but also the occasional time when, you know, one person is careless or just because it's just extremely dry, it just jumps. And so we really need to make sure that we contain fires. So we're not going to stop people from using fires. We're just needing to help control it, equip people to keep it down.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's go back to the Egyptian fruit bat for a minute. As you've said, we know that it is a reservoir host of Marburg virus. Has Nigeria suffered a Marburg outbreak ever?
No, thankfully so. So we haven't gotten one. In fact, the closest thing we've had was the community, well, a potential community spread event where someone traveled in from Liberia, and this was during the 2013 Ebola virus outbreak. But we haven't had, as far as I know, a Marburg a spillover event or even outbreak, so to speak.
Among the people who utilize Egyptian fruit bats, I guess I should put that in quotation marks, who hunt them, who eat them,
yeah.
Who exploit them, who live adjacent to them and among them. Has anyone done a serological study of those communities of people to see whether they have been exposed to Marburg?
Right, so that's kind of the next step from a study that's currently being executed in that site right now. So the study is exploring what's happening with the bats in the first place. So while we know they're hunting and whatnot, we haven't really nailed down what's even happening with the bats beyond the ecology. So kind of like what Raina said, just 3 studies, right? Mm-hmm. So there's this study that's currently running by a very strong international team. And then that will be the next step to look at what's happening with the hunters and people who consume bats.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Well, we'll stay tuned for that too. Thank you very much, Aurora. Next is Aliyu Nuhu Ahmed. He is a PhD student at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Fascinating and very eminent institution. He works with local communities on land use change, human-animal contact, and zoonotic disease risk. And Aliyu joins us this evening for him, from the Gambia. Aliyu.
Thank you very much, David. I'm going to be talking to you in a bit about our experience with implementation and some of the challenges we are facing with the communities and some of the successes recorded. So implementation of ecological countermeasures for zoonotic spillover requires a multifaceted approach that encompasses the understanding of the mechanism, adopting a One Health approach, promoting conservation, enforcing regulations, and fostering public awareness. By integrating these steps into comprehensive strategies, we can prevent the risks associated with zoonotic diseases and build a more resilient, sustainable future for both humans, animals, and the environment. But this is not without its challenges. As we have seen on the ground with the communities that we work with. We've seen challenges with ethical and cultural implications, for instance, and so ecological countermeasures, importantly, in one setting may not be feasible, practicable, or even appropriate in another setting. So it may entail imposing limits on cultural practices, for instance, like agriculture or traditional hunting. So it is critical that these measures or policies should not disproportionately affect vulnerable groups or indigenous people that rely on these practices for living. Efforts should be made to involve local communities, respect their traditions and cultures, and give viable alternatives to livelihood opportunities in order to ensure that implementation is successful. We've also seen issues around cultural preservation. There are age-long practices in some of these communities, and they just don't understand why you would come with a countermeasure, for instance, when they've been practicing these for ages. why now, and for what purpose. So measures should also not undermine or erase cultural diversity. So efforts should be made to preserve cultural heritage, knowledge, and practice while contributing to sustainable coexistence with the ecosystem in order to prevent spillovers. So by incorporating these cultural values and traditions into countermeasures, we can then foster a more holistic and inclusive approach to pandemic prevention. We also have seen in our interaction with communities that there is a seeming problem with equity and access. People lack information and knowledge on what spillover is in the first place, and then what pandemics, the risks associated with that, and the implications of onward transmission. So there really needs to be more education and sensitization of the local communities. And therefore, we've seen that collaborative decision-making is quite very important in order to overcome these challenges, including inclusive approach, engaging diverse stakeholders within the setting, including local communities, indigenous people, and marginalized groups in decision-making process. So their perspective, their knowledge, and their opinions, or what I put together as traditional ecological knowledge, is necessary in order to co-develop these countermeasures and implement them. So this promotes a sense of ownership, increases cultural sensitivity, and help ensures that countermeasures align with local context, and that makes it easy for uptake and sustenance of that measure because they feel they own that measure and is theirs, and then protecting it is therefore their responsibility as well. So for instance, we access these communities in the first place through the right access corridors. Usually the alcalde or the community leader of the community informs these people that a team of researchers are coming, this is their purpose of coming, this is what they are working on. And usually they do that through social centers. It could be religious centers, markets, or the bantaba. The bantaba is where the community in general gather under a big tree and then discuss important issues. So there we have discussions with them, and coming up right from there is they practice some of these risky behaviors that could lead to spillovers because it's because of economic purposes, and some of them hunt animals for traditional medicine. And last week we had someone that said meat from green monkeys usually helps with abdominal problems when you hunt them and you prepare them yourself and eat. So we're really getting the intrigues, the reasons why they are engaged in these activities, and knowing the nuances, then we can then work with them in order to co-develop measures and see how to implement them in a sustainable way. I give you an example. For instance, there's a community here in the Gambia that has a particular measure where people are only allowed to cut down a single tree, and you're supposed to plant multiple in replacement of that. This was co-developed with the community, and the government is not investing anything in terms of enforcing the policy because that measure is actually from the community. They feel they own it, and they usually brag about it, and we like that. It's mostly green all the time. When you go, lots of trees, their forests are intact. And so by taking these considerations into account, we can strive for fair and inclusive approach to pandemic prevention and respect cultural diversity, promote social justice, and safeguard the rights and well-being of individuals and the community. And I remember a particular discussion with one community where we were asking them, should we provide livestock, for instance? Would that be able to prevent you from hunting? Should it be 20 chickens, 10 chickens, 50, kept in the right way, and then the government provides support to help you with the livestock? And some people say, well, it could, why not 50? Why not in addition with some goats? And so you could really hear what would work for a particular community. So it is our collective responsibility to prioritize and invest in countermeasures to prevent and prepare for future zoonotic outbreaks. Targeted ecological countermeasures are sensible, equitable, and an efficient way to reduce the likelihood of pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aliyu. Thank you. What if a local community is engaged in some sort of an income earning or a food gathering activity that exposes them to the possibility of spillover, and you sit down and you have a discussion with them, and you listen to them, you hear their concerns, you explain to them the dangers of spillover, and then they expressed to you that spillover and the risk of a disease that a virus might carry ranks very low to them on the list of concerns. Life is hard in this community. People die young from a variety of things. Children may not be getting as much nutrition as they need. What if the community says, okay, we understand what you say about the risk of spillover, but it's less important to us than earning a living, than these other things that, that we have traditionally done? How do you proceed in a situation like that?
I think usually we get that from the communities. One thing is with every community, there are several challenges, and there has to be a holistic approach to both disease in terms of human well-being, whether be it nutrition, whether be it security, whether be it spillovers with diseases. So it really has to be a holistic one. And while other challenges are really key, in terms of well-being and might be in their own ranking more important. For the project, for instance, that is coming from a group of researchers, they are looking at these issues from a different perspective. That would be to encourage, both the government to look at these other issues, but then the issues of spillover and onward transmission is also has its own significant impact. For instance, it might not be a priority for that particular setting, but we know with migrant population, for instance, even if you have a local immunity in a particular village, someone can come in, pick it up, and then you have several thousands of people and millions dying. So you really need to let them understand this whole scope and concept of spillover and onward transmission. It might be the case that they think, nutrition is the most important thing, but maybe, there could be a virus that could spill over from that community and then kill millions of people. In that case, that could be more important than that particular problem, which is at the top of their hierarchy. So we recognize these challenges and we've been getting them. And importantly, we move with government departments, including Department of Livestock, Department of Wildlife, and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. So there are government officials really involved. And when they listen to this, these make up their take-home points. And, usually I'm not too confident on saying they will take an action immediately, but these are noted, and we as scientists and as enthusiasts in this particular field of human health and well-being, we usually put them on their toes and make sure they keep remembering what's coming from the community as their priority as regards health and well-being.
Thank you, Aliyu. Thank you very much, and good luck with your important work.
Thank you.
Next is Abhi Vanak. He's director of the Center for Policy Design, Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment in India. He is an ecologist who studies and works on the interactions between humans, domestic animals, and wildlife in increasingly human-dominated landscapes. And that means virtually every landscape. Abhi joins us from Bangalore. Abhi?
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on. Great pleasure to be on this panel. So I come from India, where people sort of live with the highest densities of livestock in a biodiversity hotspot. And this sort of creates a hyper-saturated interface between people, domestic animals, and wildlife. And people and animals have always been very deeply connected in everyday life. Therefore, sort of envisioning a separation as a countermeasure is difficult. And in fact, sometimes it can be counterproductive, as Aliyu was saying. People are dependent on bats and other wildlife for nutrition. So one example I would like to give you is from Nagaland, a state in the northeast of India bordering Myanmar. A recent study by colleagues from the National Center for Biological Sciences and other institutions has shown that the Nagamese community, who have been traditionally harvesting bats for food and medicine for generations, have antibodies to filoviruses. Now, these are the same family of viruses that Marburg and Ebola belong to. And these are also these viruses also found in 2 species of bats that these folks were hunting. Now, this implies that at some point of time there has been a spillover of these viruses to humans, but it hasn't caused an outbreak, at least as yet. What's concerning is that rapid land use change is disturbing some of these relationships between bat communities and hunters, and so disturbing these bat roosts, and is also bringing new people in who have no history of contact and are therefore susceptible to these diseases from bats if the spillover occurs. These populations, these migrant populations, also tend to be more mobile, and therefore the chances of a potential spillover spreading to the broader population increases. So this example highlights the need to protect indigenous rights and indigenous lands and their way of life, even if it sometimes involves consumptive use of bats and other wildlife, as well as protecting where bats roost and where they eat and so on and so forth. Another example I want to give you comes from southern India, where a PhD student of ours was studying the relationship between bats and people. And she showed that people actually value ecosystem services that are provided by bats. Now, these are cashew nut and areca nut farmers in southern India. And in these plantations, the ripe fruits are plucked by bats and taken away to their roosts. And so the bats are only eating the pulp and leaving the nuts intact. The farmers then just show up under the bat roost in the morning and are able to harvest or collect all these nuts from the floor, and it saves them a lot of labor. So they really sort of value this service that bats are providing. Bats also, as other speakers mentioned, provide guano to be used as fertilizer in their fields. So here, the countermeasure that needs to be put in place really is people need to be equipped with safer handling techniques. So basic protective gear and protocols for safely picking up these fruits so that they're not in contact with potential saliva or urine that could be disease, that could carry diseases. And of course, down the chain also, the processing of these nuts and fruits needs to be done in a manner that prevents any potential spread of disease-causing pathogens to the broader population. But overall, there are, like I said, there's a lot of interaction between people and wildlife in very human-dominated landscapes, and people have learned to live with these animals. And we've thankfully not seen any major outbreaks, but of course, that can change with the pace of land use change in these places.
Thank you, Abhi. Thank you very much. Let me ask you to go back briefly to Nagaland in the situation with new people coming in, outsiders coming in, and the issue of traditional local people's rights, even if those might involve harvesting wildlife. What is it that's bringing in new people to Nagaland? What's the draw? What's the attraction for them?
Well, just like almost anywhere else in the world, we've got land use change happening all across northeastern India. New dams are being built, for instance. New roads are being built. We have a huge push for palm oil plantations in that part of the world. So this obviously brings with it a huge influx of migrant laborers, people who are not from those communities, and sort of disrupts. Also, people's aspirations change. There is migration to cities. So all of these forces, and of course, there's deforestation happening in many of these landscapes. So all of these factors create sort of a flux in the population, and it seems only a matter of time before people come into contact with bats or with a virus that could potentially.
So these are people coming in who do not have that acquired or inherited immunity or resistance to filoviruses, right?
That's true.
And presumably they still to some degree travel back and forth between the Nagaland areas that they've settled and where they have come from. So is there a danger that they might be a conduit of transmission of a new virus that has spilled over into them and for which they have no resistance, carrying it to the rest of India, the rest of the world?
That is a real danger now, isn't it? And this is why it's really important for us to better understand some of these dynamics in these landscapes where, especially where people are, continuing consumptive use of bats, or where people are living very closely with bats. So just like with other parts of the world, we need to be able to understand these linkages better so that we can predict these risks and try maybe counteract some of these activities that could put us at risk of a massive outbreak.
Thank you, Abhi. Thank you for being with us today. Next, we have Dr. Benjamin Roche. He's research director of the French Research Institute for Sustainable Development in Montpellier, France, and he's director of the program PREZODE, an international initiative to prevent zoonotic emergence. Ben Roche.
Thanks, David. I'm very, very glad to be here with you today to talk about pandemic prevention. So as you can see on this figure, actually, I do like this analogy between pandemics and forest fire. Of course, when we have a pandemic or forest fire, we have to respond to that. We have to try to control it. But a forest fire doesn't appear like that. It has to follow a gradual process of propagation from its very beginning. So, and it's exactly the same kind of thing with pandemics. So this is why it's dramatically important to, of course, to control pandemics when we have a pandemic emerging, but it's also very important to try to develop prevention to avoid this very initial process. A recent study have shown that preventing pandemics by targeting actually the initial factors, so the main risk factors, would cost between around $20 billion a year, while the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is around more than 20,000 billion. So the return on investment is obviously huge without ever talking about the human lives that can be saved. And so what you can see on this next slide is actually this gradual process of zoonotic disease emergence, coming from the pre-emergence when different pathogens are circulating in the animal or the environmental compartments towards the first pathogen spillover to human populations, adaptation to human population, and then the propagation inside the human populations. So of course, the last steps of this gradual process is currently the focus of a lot of efforts to try to be better prepared, to try to understand how we can control better actually this kind of pandemics. But there are quite not enough actually research and operational activities toward this, what we call the primary prevention. So to try to prevent pathogen spillover. So to have a clear definition, which is my definition, but to be clear about that. So primary prevention is when we try to implement a strategy that reduces the likelihood of human exposure to zoonotic pathogen through targeting the main and core factors of zoonotic disease emergence, which are mostly deforestation, agriculture, and wildlife trade. So of course, to develop these kind of things, there are a lot of obstacles, a lot of caveats. And what you can show on this next slide is one key problem that we are trying to address right now. Because prevention strategies in zoonosis are challenging to implement because we don't have a clear visibility on their efficiency. Because by definition, we try to avoid something to happen. It's not like control when something happens and we try to fix the problem. We try to avoid the problem, and so it's not visible. And so one way to target this main problem is to quantify the risk of zoonotic disease emergence, to try to quantify how much the risk can be reduced. And so to do that, we have to have clear and standard indicators that are able to quantify this risk reduction. And so on this next slide, that's the contribution we're trying to develop between the World Health Organization and the PREZODE initiative, which is an international multilateral one
Thank you very much, Ben. And thank you again to all of our speakers this morning. I would say to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. And your questions, if you have questions, will be answered by our individual panelists. So please send them in and you will get an answer. Thanks to Raina Plowright for inviting me to take part in this and listen in on this very, very illuminating brainstorming session from these experts scattered around the world doing important work. Thanks to Cornell University for hosting this. And thanks to the organizational and technical people who've made this possible, Mary and Chris and Marcus. And again, thanks to all of you for tuning in, joining us. I want to close just with this thought. I think it's important for us to remember that we live on a planet now, not only with 8 billion humans, but with 33 billion chickens, domestic poultry, offering a great petri dish for the evolution of viruses as intermediates coming out of, for instance, birds. for instance, avian influenza. And we live also among populations of bats, declining populations of bats, declining populations of non-human primates and other wildlife around the world, and an unplumbed diversity of viruses in those animals. So it's crucial that we understand and help others understand the part that ecological interactions play among all these different forms of organism, and the threat of spillover, the preventable threat of spillover that they entail. Raina has told us that there have been tens of thousands of papers on the biology of SARS-CoV-2, how it infects human cells, its effects on the human body generally, but only 3 papers so far on coronavirus circulation and shedding in bats. It seems to me that one of the first steps now has to be an increase in that body of research. But even before that, there's an important need for all of us to educate funders, policymakers, and the general public on the fact that spillovers, rare as they may be, rare as pandemic causing spillovers may be, spillovers, as common as they are, still are preventable. Spillovers are preventable. That's the message from these experts that I've heard today. So again, thank you very much. And everyone, have a good, safe, healthy day.